They had to just start building to figure it out. And in that process of building it, each of them would contribute a little bit of a different lens. They would build it, it would break, they would build it, it would break, they would build it, and then finally start working, and then of course break. And so, they would go through this multiple release of an idea. Where on the other side of the fence, they would go out and they would build something only once they've sat through the whole planning phase. They just don't see enough when you're sitting at the planning phase. Yeah, we've got one in the Philippines who is just so instrumental in our business, and we've done everything we can to make sure she's well looked after. There's so many companies out there that don't treat VAs as a person. They treat them as a commodity, and I just don't believe in that. I have a fundamental, vehemently strong argument against that process.
Yeah, I would love to have that topic, that conversation, if there's something that leads us there.
Yeah, 100%.
Exactly, because
we are there because we are on the money, we are on the mindset, we are on the mentoring podcast.
Yeah, that's right.
And guys, we have Andy McMullen here today with us. Andy is in the multifamily space in real estate, legacy acquisitions, but we're not really here to talk really about real estate, even though I think it's something that is a passion for both of us. Knowing that I have a mortgage business and the real estate company up here, but the idea is people, really kind of talking about people and how important people are when you're looking to build an organization. We just did a webinar where we talked about one of our products, how it helps people who are the hobbypreneur, the person who's just kind of getting going, the solopreneur who, loves doing everything until they realize they can't do everything, to then the entrepreneur who is looking to build and scale through people. And as you get into that moment of being the entrepreneur, now it's time, you can't be a leader without somebody to lead. And so, you've had a very effective career of being able to lead people, building your investment portfolio up to, I think, nearly 3,000 doors, I think is what you were saying. And you can't do that alone.
Yeah. I think people talk about, this idea with our investors all the time is this, well, you're going to take our money and you're going to pull it out of the deal, right? That's subtraction. But really, if you're doing it the right way and you're doing it to bless those people that you're investing in, that's multiplication. Well, it's the same thing with your team, right? We talk a little bit about VAs even just in our normal conversation, Steve. The importance of a VA, if they're treated as part of your team, there's a multiplicative, factor involved in that basically leverages itself as opposed to, taking 20 hours here and separating them from the rest of your organization. It all needs to be integrated.
Yeah, totally. I think in an integrated organization, the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. And each part plays its part in driving that machine forward. And each part is important. I mean, you could have a screw and a huge machine. And if that screw falls out, the whole thing's falling to pieces. And the same thing can happen in a business is if you have one part collapse, I mean, hopefully you build some redundancy in your processes and some checks and balances and that sort of thing. But, some of those really key important roles, man, if they start to fall apart, the whole thing falls apart. When you have that person who is, we talked a little bit about the solopreneur, and I want to kind of hit that. And you've got that person, they're kind of running, they're kind of doing everything. I think in the real estate space, especially, I've seen this. I was just talking with a broker who is, taking some of his business and going down to the States. So he's abandoning all of his property in Canada, which we're seeing that happen a lot. They're banning a lot of their property in Canada and starting to buy up in the States, but he's buying those sort of onesie, twosie units and going to get his feet wet. And that's what I think, why don't you haul past to just getting into bigger stuff? But they don't have that connection to the bigger things yet. They think that, well, I got to go through these spots. I want to kind of ask about that. Do you think that's a good strategy for that solopreneur? Do they need to just start thinking bigger right from the beginning?
Well, there's a couple of things when I'm asked that question. There's the bigger idea, what does that mean? Does it mean bigger as far as the kinds of deals that they're going after, or bigger in the sense that they're more communicative with a community of people that can help them? So when I say bigger, as far as the community of the people that you need in order to build your organization, there's no question that you cannot do this by yourself. I don't care if you are the smartest, the most brilliant, the best underwriter, the best negotiator, the best deal finder. All of those things you could be fantastic at, and maybe you can work 23 hours a day, but you cannot be as good as myself with Steve and two other people that have kind of figured out the focus of their intention to either find that deal or underwrite that deal, and then iterate, as we talk about very frequently.
Yeah, I think the idea of iteration, there was there's a study where I think it was an engineer or a small group of engineers were placed against a bunch of people who didn't know what they were doing specifically. And that large group, what they did is the first thing they were tasked with building some machine or some object or whatever it was. And the first thing they did was just try it because they had no idea what to do. So they couldn't sit down and plan. They had to just start building to figure it out. And in that process of building it, each of them would contribute a little bit of a different lens. They would build it, it would break, they would build it, it would break, they would build it, and then finally start working, and then, of course, break. And so, they would go through this multiple release of an idea. Where on the other side of the fence, they would go out and they would build something only once they've sat through the whole planning phase. They just don't see enough when you're sitting at the planning phase. But when you're getting out and actually doing it and iterating, you actually see so much more than when you're sitting at that beginning and just planning. So I think the idea of just getting out, that is so important, and really overcoming that inertia of just doing something.
Yeah, I'm always I love talking about the idea of this inertia because you brought back that solopreneur factor. Like that's the part that the solopreneur sometimes misses. Like, oh yeah, I'm going to take 90% of the pie and maybe I'd buy a couple of VAs, right? But they always forget about that additional part of what is it that drives you and what is that gets you juiced. And usually it's after you have a conversation with somebody on your team or you figure something out or you kind of have this, like I talked about earlier, this multiplicative sensation of something that's bigger than you and more important. And that's very hard to do if there's not a purpose and people that you rely on to get you to that spot. So as a solopreneur, you miss that part of that. And that inertia becomes much more powerful. And when I talk about inertia, what I mean is you're sitting in your couch and you're like, gosh, I know that I should be doing this, but I can't. And all of those reasons why, if you're doing it by yourself or for yourself, it's much, much more difficult than you're doing it with others.
I always relate inertia to enthalpy. And because I love science, I love math, and enthalpy is really interesting when you look at the change of state. So let's think about a liquid turning into a gas turning into liquid, or even something turning solid, a liquid turning solid. The change of state requires so much energy. I think when you look at, what a BTU is, which is a British thermal unit, a British thermal unit is the amount of energy required to heat a pound of water by 1 degree. And that's sort of a uniform line up until you get to that change of state. And as soon as you go to change of state, the amount of energy to go from, say it's, 1 degree to 0 degree to freezing, that might take that 1 BTU, but to go to that frozen moment, now it's taking 800 BTUs. And that happens when a liquid turns into a gas. That's why refrigeration works, because the change of state has this enormous release of energy and why it can be so efficient in a lot of different processes. So the change of state is something that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people, when they look at people, they don't realize that the amount of energy it's required to change that state of doing nothing, to change that state of doing something, to change that state of being a solopreneur to being an entrepreneur requires a massive amount of energy to make that change of state. Once it's done, you can get back to a different graph style. But that point is a huge point in somebody's momentum.
Yeah, and when you think about just anything that anybody that's listening right now of something that you've created that was big, right? Or that you look back and you think, man, I never thought I could do that. I never thought I would be able to do that. It almost always involves these kinds of little habits that have created over time, and that might be a change of state from the time that you were getting up. I'm a big fan of savers. I'm sure you've read Hal Elrod's book, which is, the miracle morning of, look, you're going to have the savers. That's the silence in the morning, and then you're going to have your affirmations. For me, that's the reading my devotional and Bible, the visual, like kind of visualizing those things that you need to get done, the exercise, which is such an important part of what you talk about, right? Which is that energy release, that serotonin that you're releasing in your body, and the reading, and then just the scribing, which is really the writing. But all of those are like small things that you do every day, and the kind of multiplying effect of those things throughout the rest of your day, getting into that past that 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, those things are really tough to get past. But if you have those kinds of small things that allow you to do that, now you're able to build. And that's the same, like you talked about, the transfer of energy between people. I'm not feeling very good, but Steve, he's moving. I got to keep up. So those things are really important. People think that they're just, this might sound trite or like we've heard it before, but there's something that's mysterious about the way that this energy is transferred.
Well, I mean, look at excited electrons or protons or whatever it is inside a balloon. That the more they get excited, the more pressure builds into the balloon. The less they get excited, the balloon starts to deflate. And I think that happens in the physical world, and I think that happens in the emotional space, in the ethereal of what we don't understand. Is that the less energy that exists, and it doesn't have to be that outwardly high energy, I'm shaking kind of vibrating energy. I mean, you could have a smooth, calm, quiet, but poised energy, and both can exhibit the same outcome. They both can release the same amount of energy, just presented in a little bit of a different way. And I think that is something that you really need to look at. Are you an energy absorption tool at that moment, or are you projecting and giving energy to the world? Now, from your perspective, I think sometimes you see that when people are doing that and they've kind of got over the inertia of getting things going, and they get into action and they get into gears of doing things, there's sometimes moments where they kind of go, and then that graph that we talked about that was running real nice starts to flatten out. And it's not like anything's changed that you visibly can see. It's something invisible that changed, and they get you see teams or individuals get stuck. I want to talk a little bit about how to, first of all, identify that they're getting stuck, and what are the early stages that you could figure that out, and then what can you do to, change the course of that outcome?
Yeah, Steve, my dad was a basketball coach, and one of the things that he was really good at for me in teaching me anything was to break it down into these kind of really small parts. And that sounds so, of course, trivial maybe and simple. But when you kind of think about almost everything that you're doing throughout the day, it does become complacent. And even if you look at your best achievements, you look back at them and you say, well, of course that happened, because I did all of these things, but they've become mundane, and it's become part of your, whether you've achieved now a few hundred units or you're on to your next stage, those things all kind of seem, well, that was then. And so I think that if we're able to kind of think about it intellectually, and this is why I talk about the savers part, which is so writing and reading is really important part of the process. The writing part, this is the part that I think this is so important, is because with every day, you're kind of writing through all of the chaff. If you just write those 2-3 pages, there's this great book called The Morning Pages. I don't know if you've ever read it, but the idea is that in the morning, you're kind of writing all these visual, everything that you're anxious about. Oh no, I got this pod with Steve, and he's going to ask me all these questions about inertia, et cetera, and I'm kind of like trying to figure out, and then it starts to become clear as to what my objectives are during the day. And if I do that in the morning, I can start to think back about those things that I knew didn't really feel like much, kind of like what we talked about, those little, turn the toad in the water, he's turning up just a little bit more. But then you can kind of start to recognize, oh, that's the reason. It was these habits. And they were in small pieces. So what my dad was really good at was breaking this down to the mechanics of the basketball shooting or the dribbling, and then you can kind of take it to the next phase. So I don't know if that's helpful for people, but it was really helpful for me, as simple as it sounds.
Well, in its simplicity, I think it's complicated. I think the idea that somebody's going to start their day with the idea of evaluating, what are the complexities that they're going to face, and actually taking that and converting that into a written document. Most people, they stop it up in their head, and what they don't realize is what you think, what you say is what you do becomes your legacy. And that was something I got from Brandon Dawson. And I think that's something that they miss, those next parts that really bring that into life. I mean, I can think about all the different ways that I'm going to choke somebody in jiu-jitsu in the morning, but unless I actually write down my methods that I can say, okay, well, how does that connect to this technique? How does that connect to this technique? I can't really fully outlay a whole idea, a whole landscape of what really the system and model is that I'm going to implement. I might just think I'm going to choke that person, but it's not going to work unless I actually write it down. Because once I write it down, I've sort of breathed it into existence, and I can look at it and it's full of what it is, and then actually execute against it.
So fascinating. And what you talk about when jiu-jitsu, my son is doing the same thing, and I try to get him to visualize on paper, because what it does is, like, we're just naturally, it's part of our human condition, right? Whatever religion you believe in, whatever faith, whatever you kind of seen in your children, that there's just this negativity that's constantly flowing through, and we're very kind of, we're self-absorbed, whether you want to admit it or not. But once you kind of write out that kind of, oh yeah, this is the reason that I'm feeling this way, it's all kind of gone. It evaporates into giving you this kind of freedom, this space that's available to think about, well, this is kind of how I want to approach it. So I'm no longer, Steve, anxious about how I'm going to, or what am I going to do if somebody attacks me. Now I'm just kind of free to think about, oh, here's the strategy, here's the tactics that I'm going to need to be able to, enable in order to get to. So it's very simple, but it is very powerful. And I know people are probably rolling their eyes, because of course, we've heard this, but I guarantee you, just try this. Just try it for 2 weeks and see if your life doesn't change. And then you can ask Steve about it. Maybe have you on.
Well, I think about fighters, and fighters, when they go into the ring, they never operate at their highest level of training. They always operate at their lowest level of training. When you look at the military going into a war, it's at the lowest level of training, because when you're at the highest level of stress, you're always going to operate at the lowest level of training. We had a fighter fight on the weekend, MMA match, and a very accomplished striker, really good Muay Thai, really good elbows, really good distance management, and his jiu-jitsu is fantastic. And usually when he takes somebody's back, he's going to choke them. And it was a 3-round match. Round 1, he would take the guy down to the ground, but he would lose control. Round 2, he'd take him down to the ground, lose control. And everybody's up the fronts. Whenever they would break away, he wouldn't, measure distance for an elbow or just really do all these things that I've just seen him do in the gym. And it's because, when you look at those systems and models that he has implemented in his brain, when it comes time to do it, it wasn't implemented, because it maybe at that moment he wasn't connected to those things. And should he have maybe written those down, and especially if he could write them down and review them in writing, in person, look at them and say, this is what I'm going to do, they maybe have been more prevalent, maybe have been more in front of him. Not sure if he wrote them down or not, but it's definitely something where if you're in a stressed environment, you're going to fall not to your best moment, your best trained element. You're going to fall to the lowest level of training.
Yeah, one of my heroes is Coach Wooden, Coach John Wooden, the famous basketball coach, and he's got kind of this pyramid of success, and the pyramid that you're describing is that competitive greatness. Can you be your best when your best is needed? And all of those things that kind of filter down from there happen to do with, your programs, with your attitude, with your industriousness, right? With your loyalty. There's kind of all these pieces of the puzzle. And part of that is the poise. And do you have that poise in that moment? Because it's not something you're thinking about at that moment, but you prepared for it. And a lot of that, and that's kind of what we're using now, is the visualizing, the writing it down, the thinking about, have I gone through this process in my head, so that it does become such second nature. I play the piano, and I know the parts that I struggle with. I know it's the myelin that's eventually going to get there if I just keep repeating that, the right way long enough that it's going to be kind of become second nature. And if you have that trust, then once you're in that competitive greatness, arena, you can rely on all of those things that your discipline, provided you with.
Trust is an interesting word to use because I think a lot of times people will say, trust the process, trust the process, trust the process. And it's almost overused. And I think trusting the process really comes through discipline, because if you've implemented that before and you've tested that before through massive imperfect action, through iterative processes, you're going to see that trust starts, you build a connection to success through the implementation of a process. And if you don't actually test things, you can't make that connection. And I think when we talk about earlier on, when we talk about inertia, to get from a state of not doing something to a state of doing something, it's because you don't have a trust with the action that you're going to take. And it's because you haven't had that discipline and you haven't had that iterative process to actually connect to success. And that's probably one of those big things that's weighing heavy in your mind, and that's stopping you from getting to that next level.
I was thinking about this last week, Steve, about some of the deals that just crushed me early on in my career, and I'm actually somewhat amazed. I think that there is some divine providence that whatever that was that gave me that strength to kind of carry on, or the good luck, however you want to describe it, to carry on, because I didn't have the trust and the faith. And that's why I think a lot of people that are in my world are afraid to start businesses, because there's so many kind of trials early on that your discipline has not given you the tools to deal with, right? You get in the ring the first time with somebody who's experienced, maybe much older and slower, but they've kind of figured out some of these things. And I think that's why, the trust part is one of those things where you can kind of talk about it, but do you really have the faith because you've put in the work to understand that this is going to change? There's going to be a season that you're going into or you're likely coming out of, but you're probably either going into or coming out of. You're not really in that season of just kind of, stasis. So I think that now I look back at some of those deals, I wouldn't react in the same way. I would have a lot more of that kind of faith and resolution. Now that doesn't mean things are going to work out, because they always don't. But if it's not the end, then it's worked out.
It's the beginning of something.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of times you talk about that motion from the different seasons. And I was at a Tony Robbins event where he talked about seasons quite a bit. And it seems very thematic this year, people talking about seasons, because I think we're seeing societies going through a change in season as much as people are. And with the advent of the migration of the baby boomers into the next chapter and to their next season. And I think people need to understand the one most important thing. There's no such thing as a steady state. There's no such thing as I'm in a moment, and that moment will not change, because whether you believe it or not, the world's going to be changing around you. Your perspective is going to be changing. People's perspective of you is going to be changing without you even knowing it. And so to recognize that you have to be constantly changing, it's the decision to say whether I'm going to be actively choosing to make that choice or I'm going to be letting somebody else make it for me.
And can I stay in that uncomfortable part that I know is going to be forever changing? It's very difficult, with my 3 kids. If they've had a great day, you expect that day is going to continue. And I just, we'll see. Or like, Coach Wooden would talk about never getting too high or too low. It's much easier said than done. I actually think that I have somewhat of a defect, and I'd be curious to hear your take on it, is that because of the experience that I've had in starting a business and things kind of going awry, if something is going well, I am kind of looking around for that other shoe to drop. And I know that there's there's a lot of people that deal with that. So I'd be curious to know from your point of view, can you accept that good without looking around when's the other, shoe dropping on that centipede that's surrounding me?
Yeah. I think about the way people learn as the way to answer that one. And I think, people learn in 4 quadrants. First of all, you have the unconscious ignorance where you don't know what you don't know. And you're operating that sort of void that you have no idea that you don't know you have a problem. There's something going on, but you have no clue it's about to happen or it's happening right now. The second quadrant is the conscious ignorance where you don't know something. Now you have to make a choice whether you're going to do something about it or you're just going to keep on with the status quo. Then you get to conscious knowledge, which is you're now actively engaged in learning something and you've got to think about it every time that you do it. The highest level is where you have that unconscious knowledge where you can just be on a steady state solving things. The challenges, the biggest, most dangerous points are unconscious ignorance and unconscious knowledge. Because when you're operating at that point, like you just hit a massive success, everything seems to be going great and you're just not paying attention and bam, something hits you. And those are where I think people really can make those mistakes. And people who have that skill of they've been through it before, they've had that problem before, as soon as they start just even tasting that unconscious knowledge, they drop right back down into conscious knowledge of saying, what do I not know?
That's excellent. I love that. Clip that, producer. I think about that a lot too, because I know just from my experience that when I am feeling a little bit off, or when I am feeling maybe even a little bit lazy, right? That's part of the reason that I try to do as many things as I can, because I know if I become too introspective, I can, fall deep into myself. As part of the reason that I don't love birthdays, because they're like the one time a year you're not thinking about other people. You're thinking of like you've got this team leading up to yourself, and that's kind of how we become more and more depressed. But my point is that usually you can sense there's a reason for my lethargy. It's something that I just do not yet want to face. I don't want to make that call up to that partner and have that conversation, or I just know that I should be looking at it from this perspective and I don't. So that kind of falls into that, the unconscious starting to become conscious, and the more experience that you discuss, as you discussed, you can start to recognize those pieces that are out of place.
Yeah, you mentioned the word lethargy, and I think lethargy it can be taken as a really, strong word, but I think where it's the most dangerous is when it's a weak lethargy, where it's an unrecognized lethargy, where you just, I'll deal with that tomorrow. Yes, I'll deal with it. And it just things get put off, and things that maybe are even important that get put off. If you've got a team member who's experiencing that and going through that, what's some of the tool sets that they can use to, first of all, identify it, and second of all, action and get into solving whatever that is that they need to work on?
Yeah, and this is kind of the part, as you know, in running a business, is that you've got these kind of humans that are all going through these different varying seasons, right? And we've got one of our people just had their first baby, right? So it's 30 days old, and they're on cloud nine. They're incredibly tired and maybe a little bit cranky, but there's these high joys and this new vulnerability that they're experiencing for the very first time. And then you've got people going in their seasons that are like, oh, I don't know if this is for me, etc. So I think all of those things come down to understanding that there are people that are there to talk and listen to them. And that is not as easy as it sounds, right? Because if you've got, and our team is smaller, we've got 13 folks, but you've got 13 different lives with their own church communities, with their own families, with their own neighborhoods, and they're all going through these things. And so I think that, I'm a man of faith. So for me, what I feel like we can take with us is our relationships. And so the kind of communicating part is such a big piece of that. And then I would say, hey, look, now that you've got that off your chest, let's try to break it into a small piece, write out what it is that you want to achieve that's bothering you, and then let's take it from there. But trying to beat it all at once is an impossible undertaking.
John Cleese before he did Monty Python, he used to actually do business training videos.
I did not know that. And I'm a big fan of that. I did not know that.
I remember the first time I took adult learning courses, this was, oh my gosh, back in the 90s. And it was a video with him teaching how to implement adult learning strategies. And one of the things he talked about was the idea of bit by bit. And if you think about our phone numbers in North America, it falls under that category. You have the area code, then you have the next 3 numbers, and then you have the 4 numbers. That's why we as North Americans get so confused when we look at the European phone numbers, where there's like 18 numbers and a multitude of different orders. And is there a plus? Is there not a plus? I don't know. It can be very confusing for us because we have an order to things. We have packages of information, and we're able to break that out. And by breaking out those different packages and then creating relationships, it gets into almost like a programmatic style relationship with data, is that we get to object-oriented understanding. And we can relate those objects together. And by taking those pieces and then grouping them together and then grouping those bigger pieces together, we can understand a very complicated thing and put that into actual action, because we can break it down into those just chunks that are easy to digest.
And to add to that, it's part of the reason that I'm such a big fan of reading. And you think about all of the richest people and richest CEOs, and I would, aside from even wealth, let's just talk about success. The reason that because their brain is being rewired, as you mentioned, in those small pieces. For everything that you learn, you're basically attaching something to that. And you're attaching something to that. So we're having this conversation. People are learning something new. There may be just a different way that we presented an idea, and now they're attaching that to something already in engineering that they understand, or architecture that they understand, and their mental models are constantly growing. And that bit by bit piece, though it seems like kind of a heavy lift and a slog sometimes. Just know that connection, that bit connection that you talked about, is this great brick by brick. I'm a big fan of the Stonecutter's credo, which is the idea that whenever I'm down in the dumps, I go to a stonecutter and I watch him hit his stone blow by blow, and I know at that 101st blow that it breaks apart. I know that it wasn't that 101st blow; it was everything in between, right, and before. And that's the part that's hard for people to, that bit. Like, how do I get out of that bit?
Yeah, and that we talked earlier about discipline, and the stonecutter story is a really interesting story about discipline. Because you're going to go through 100 times doing something and nothing is going to happen. Every single time you hit it, they're like visually, you don't feel it, you don't see it. There's no progress, at least to the untrained eye. But that stonecutter knows that each one of those little things that they've committed to, those moments of discipline, will lead to that final moment when the big thing happens, which is when that break happens in that stone, in that perfect line that creates that cut that now they can mount or do whatever they need to do with that stone. I think the discipline is probably one of the hardest things to implement for people who get bored quickly. Because in my opinion, discipline can be extremely boring. Because, when you go to the gym, 5:30 in the morning, every day, we do the same thing when we start it every day. Sometimes we even play the same music every day. Sometimes we change it up. But, it's always, there's a rhythm to things, and that rhythm is the discipline. But it's extremely boring. Do you think success carries the same level of boredom?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and something that I think about all the time, because I think about in my 20s and 30s, this idea of trying to have this excitement while you're building something. And it's almost like the kind of romanticism of those books you read about these, entrepreneurs, right? You kind of read about, whether it's, Rockefeller or Carnegie with steel, or even something more modern, Elon Musk's book, I think, is just so fascinating. But it's kind of like just the idea of having that written in a book or a movie already kind of romanticizes something that's really very mundane to a certain degree, right? It's very daily. It's very kind of boring. And so I think that if people are trying, and entrepreneurs in general, we're just kind of driven to the idea of this excitement and that shiny object, and I can build this thing, and maybe I'm a great business starter, but I'm not a good finisher or implementer. And so I think that anybody that can do, as you talked about earlier, state changes that can still lead you in that same direction, in that path, but it might be writing, it might be listening to a little bit different music, it might be talking to the Steves of the world and getting their perspective. There's something that can take you out of that mundaneness. And I think that for me, understanding that there is something very, very incredibly rewarding in that discipline. You hear Kobe talk about all the time about his process. Like, he was excited about the process. Now, we reached great heights, but he was excited about the process, and he had to figure out ways to make it fun. So I know that's a little longer answer than I probably should have gone on about that, but it's something I've thought about for many, many years. How do you make something that sucks and that's not glamorous fun?
I think it goes down to the idea that when you talk about Kobe Bryant and you talk about him being excited about something, and that really wasn't the thing that drove him to success. I look at that sort of like motivation. Many times people will go to a conference. I think you're going to the wealth building conference or whatever it is, and people will go to those events and they get rah and all excited. They walked across their coals, they've sang their songs, they've done whatever they needed to do, and they're all so motivated. Then they get back to real life. And I'm going to do it next week. I'll do it the week after, and then it never happens. And that's where people always put, well, you didn't have the discipline. Okay, well, fine. Now I've got discipline. I'm going to do discipline. I'm going to do the same thing every day, all day, and I'm going to stick to my roadmap. I've got my plan in place. What I always look at a discipline is it has chinks in its armor too, because discipline can start to fade when willpower isn't there. And to willpower is that commitment to discipline. And it's almost like a little circle that happens. And that commitment to discipline really comes from celebrating wins, because I think a lot of people miss out on that one. A lot of people, when they're doing that boring moment, they don't celebrate that small win. Small win might be, hey, I made 50 calls today. Check mark. I hit 50 calls. Did I get a sale? No. I did 50 burpees. Did I win my tournament? No. But I did do 50 burpees. I did 50 burpees for 50 days, check mark. So I think the idea of celebrating wins is one of those things, and wins don't have to be momentous. Wins can be very small, but I think the idea of celebrating wins is the thing that helps somebody, number one, stay disciplined, stay motivated, and be able to celebrate the boredom of success. Because success, again, it's a grind. It's not something, if you win the GameStop thing and that was your thing and that was your claim to fame, great, you got your moment. But what are you doing tomorrow to sustain that level of success? Yeah, and that comes through discipline.
I think about as one thing I probably learned later in life is the ways that you just described to gamify things. And for me, a big part of our business is prospecting, constantly meeting people and prospecting, right? And gamify the number of conversations that you can have that are meaningful in themselves, right? You and I are having a conversation. I'm getting a certain energy transfer. You're getting a certain energy transfer. So those things are really valuable in and of themselves. But at the end of the day, I've got these 50 conversations or whatever that is that I've had. And now, maybe next week I'm not feeling it, right? I'm getting over a sickness or something that brings me down. And so now I got to let myself off the hook. I didn't get that 50, so now I drop it down a little bit. But I don't give up. I don't stop. Like, that's what I think a lot of people do. That's why I love the book, James Clear's book about the Atomic Habits. Is you don't need to give up, right? Just because you missed a mark, you get back on the next day, right? And a lot of people just want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So maybe adjust your program and let yourself off the hook. Go see a movie. You can pick it up to, this. We often underestimate those things in that 90 days. We obviously overestimate those things we can achieve in a day. We've heard that before. And that's real because we can do things over time that will stack on itself.
Each one of those failures that you might have in that day is a moment that you can actually celebrate. I always tell people that the way you can win every single day, no matter if you hit your goals or not, is that if you look at the fact that you've identified why you didn't hit your goals. And if you can do that and you put that in your personal development column to start to work on and to fix, and you're going to address it ASAP, whatever ASAP means, you've now identified a problem. And if you've identified a problem, I call that a success. So if you could walk away at the end of the day hitting some of your goals and identifying all the problems, even if you don't know how to solve it, you've at least identified that, you've won 100% of that day. Go out with confidence, go home with your head held high, and know that tomorrow you're going to have a nice list of what you're going to address and move on with purpose and with celebration.
I love that idea that you've probably talked about this on your show before, and I've heard you before, but maybe it's time to reiterate it because I think it's so powerful, is that you've kind of created this game. You've gamified your task for that day. The ones that you haven't been able to check off, you move them to this other kind of personal development column, right? And that personal development column is being, built and built and built, and all those tasks, they don't lose, they don't disintegrate, right? If they didn't get done, they don't stay on that list. They kind of move to this other grander list that has so much more, juice and perspective in and of itself. I don't know if there's anything to add there, but I just thought your perspective of that is just so fantastic.
I think a lot of times if people don't identify their personal development moments and take the identification of that as a success, they start turning into hoarders of problems. And as they start hoarding problems, those problems start to turn to be the monkey in their back. And it starts to build and it starts to build and it starts to build. And they stop producing success because they have all these unaddressed things that they've dealt with. In a book written by Grant Cardone, he talks about sell or be sold. And the idea is that anything that you're either selling an idea or you're being sold something. You're being sold, you're selling a concept, you're being sold something. My kid says, I'm not doing the dishes. I don't get him to do it. I bought it. That's something that I just bought that day. And so the idea is if you don't recognize those moments of the things that you bought in a day and then put them in the right category and address them, you're not going to hoard those things. And as you hoard something, it's going to really sit and you have no idea why you're not being successful. It's because you haven't had addressed those things that you've bought that you weren't willing to buy, but you bought them anyways. Now, when you look at the business of real estate, and we'll talk about real estate for a moment, because real estate, it's a business like everybody else. I think a lot of people talk about real estate from wealth generation, not just from an actual business standpoint. It's been a hot mess lately, dude. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on in real estate. There's so many things we got the weather patterns that are going down in Florida that are pretty aggressive, that are putting a lot of real estate at risk. We've got weather patterns going on in interest rates that are making things fluctuate like crazy. And then we got the government throwing in all of these new legislations that are putting a lot of landlords and tenants at risk. You're operating in a constant state of crisis, but you're operating in a constant state of crisis with an asset that has such a long lens of impact. How do you manage that?
Yeah, with every piece of real estate that we've ever bought, we've treated it like a business. And in that business, there's kind of an ascending market, there's a descending market, and we tend to think of these things in macro terms, like you just kind of referenced. Like, we turn on the news and, man, it's, Florida's getting pummeled, right? And they just got past lien. So in our business, we had insurance costs that went up, 2-3 times. So those are some things that we cannot, those are, either it's act of God or something to the market, interest rates. We don't necessarily get to control those outcomes, right? But there are things, like in any business, that we can control. We can take better care of our people. We can prospect better. We can find better opportunities. And that sounds, very vague, find better opportunities. But it's not, when the water shut off in 2008 in the great, financial crisis, we were lucky. We were developing, projects in Venice Beach. And I remember there was no lending, no money at all, right? Now, we had an opportunity we had all these units that we had built. We had no one to lease them to. Well, we had to go to the Googles of the world, those companies that were doing well. We had to go to the tech companies, and we had to lease to them. We had to figure out ways to, maybe we're going to cut our losses at some point. But there's all of these kinds of real estate's a cyclical business, and it doesn't ebb and flow in every particular market. So maybe Florida is a little more expensive. That also means that maybe there's a better buying opportunity. Maybe there's other places in the South or the Midwest. So I think when people think about it in business, anybody from even Meta, who a year ago was struggling, and now what's their number like? So I think there's constantly factors that are at play. Now that doesn't mean that you discount them. You have to take them into account. Check into the reality hotel, but you're also going to have to make some changes that are different than what you did 2 years ago.
There was this fella I used to always run into. I haven't seen him in a long time, going from airport to airport. I'd be in, Boston, or I'd be in Detroit, or I'd be in Florida, wherever, in Orlando or whatever. And I ran him. I'd always see him at the restaurant, and so we'd always say, "Hey, how you doing?" We'd check in. He was a real estate investor as well, and he'd be saying, "Boise's up right now," and he'd be talking about the swing that's happening in Boise, and then be Scottsdale's going to be a buy 6 months from now, and be talking about the ebbs and the flows of the different markets. There's a lot of focus right now for people on, especially investors coming from Canada, talking about the Sun Belt states, that this is the ultimate mecca of everything real estate. Is that, number one, true, or are there other markets that people are overlooking?
Oh, there's no doubt that there's other markets that people are overlooking, and for the same reason that there's markets in Alabama, for instance, that are ascending, and other ones that are descending, or that are basically, as you're kind of in that path of progress. We do a lot of development in the Southeast, and the reason we like it is because we can build land, right? We can buy land that's less expensive, and then we've got factors like we've got municipalities that really want us there. And so we can build, in 12 months or 18 months, where here in California, I live in San Diego, it's probably not much different for you in Ontario now, where you've kind of got, regulations everywhere you step. We still own stuff in Central California that's, we can't get residents out of our units for months and months and months. So I think there's always various factors. So to answer your question, yeah, there's markets now in the Midwest that maybe have been kind of just starting to grow, right? Part of the reason that Elon, X left, SpaceX left, California, is because, Lorena Gonzalez says, screw him and his 36,000 families that he's got in California, right? So he goes to Texas, and they're doing well, and now they're looking at other markets. So I think it is cyclical, but there's no doubt that there's markets, even maybe in Florida, right? There's depending on the insurance costs, that I think people can really consider studying just for that small, market.
When you talk about macro affecting the micro,
yeah,
what sort of macro indicators would somebody be looking at? What would be something that?
So it's interesting if you were to get on, LinkedIn or Facebook, and you were to just read, 2 weeks ago about interest rates, going up, going down 50 basis points, and people would be thinking, well, why the knee-jerk reaction? There must be something underlying in this economy that's kind of really forcing people to consider. They're just like 3-4 months ago, we were just going to do a quarter point, right? But then you kind of hear the job data, right? And then the job data, it basically shows that there was revised jobs down, 85,000 from the last one. And then you had 2 weeks before the election, the jobs go back up. So I think it's not so much the data in and of itself, it's the people that are interpreting that and the media that's presenting it. I think about Bill Ackman, during COVID, he got on CNBC and said, "Hey, look, I think, we got to shut this economy down for 2 months." And people are thinking, well, he's not, he's not looking at this from a government point of view. He's looking at it from his hedge point. So we better sell, right? But maybe he was really just looking at that information. He wasn't Fauci, but he was just considering what's going on around it. So anyways, what I'm saying is that for every person that's kind of viewing this, you kind of have to consider that micro market that you're working in and those variables that you can control. Because we all made money. Steve, you made money in markets that were down markets. You made money in areas that kind of where there were particular pockets that weren't doing well. It's just that's kind of the study of it.
But I've lost money in both too.
That's right. That's right. And you're still here, right?
And I'm still here. I think that's so poignant. I think a lot of times we look at the data that's given us and it's served up for reasons that have not anything to do with the actual data, but they're looking for the response of people to the data when you're looking at the macro, especially when it's coming from large news feeds and that sort of thing, where there's an agenda maybe behind that data. My wife has always said, trust the data to give the information for who paid to get the data. And that generally will tell you, what that data is going to skew. And so when you're looking at those macro, data points is really start to say, where did the data come from? Is it a good sampling of data? And is it the right data? And then start looking at it. I think when you look at jobs, for example, if jobs are growing, but 90% of them are government jobs, is that really growth in jobs, or is that just more government burden on an already tired GDP?
And I think I read recently that there's millions of I would say millennials that just have decided they're to stop looking for work, right? So they're not even counted. They don't even get to the stage. They're just like, I'm either going to live with my parents or I'm going to take government, whatever that is. So I think that you got to kind of consider. Now, we could go on and on about that macro data, but is that going to affect how I treat my team? Probably not. It's going to be one consideration, but there's going to be an eye test, and that eye test over time, as we talked about, is with the experience. It's like, I don't know if you watch football, but you kind of hear all of this data, and now they've got, now it's 82% of the quarterbacks are they're completing their pass. They're 82% completion now. It was like 50 and 60 when I was. But you can kind of watch it, and they're like, these scores are like 20 and 20 because they're just 5 yards here, 5 yards there, 10 yards here, two high safeties. So you got to kind of consider the eye test when you're looking at this data, because it can kind of, if you let it can dictate your life, and you don't have that nuanced information when you let it dictate your life.
Yeah, and that happens in so many elements of business too. We see it a lot in the sales arena, where people focus on things like closing ratio. Like, I close 70% of the deals that I get. It's like, well, that's because you're not looking enough deals. I mean, you've got 4 that cross the plate. What about the 40 that you didn't take a stab at? You're missing so many opportunities, and because you're focusing on the wrong stats. And I think you called it that eye test. And I think that's one of those things where, having that data and really understanding, does it factor in? I mean, when we're building out KPIs for business, that's one of those things that you really got to say and really got to test. Is it truly the metric that you're looking for? And, these aren't the droids you're looking for. Are these the metrics you're looking for? And that's something that I think it can really lead you astray if you don't have the right ones. Now, with real estate, to kind of close things off and looking at the lens for the next 3, 5, 6 years, not holding you to it, but what predictions do we have in real estate in the U.S.? What are some of the things that people should look for coming out the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, well, I think that the one thing that we've learned in our business development in the last 5 years is this idea that there are younger people, millennials and younger, that couldn't care less about the American dream of owning a home. And that's really a game changer, right? Because what if you're not that one renter on your block that had that kind of, whatever you knew that particular person, maybe they didn't have their lawn, but now if you're living in new stuff and new tech, and we know that there's very little supply, and in the multifamily space, Steve, we think about Wall Street owns 55% of multifamily market, right? So if there's no longer that stigma of, being a renter, and there's only a small percentage of Wall Street that's owning homes that are built to rent, and in addition to that, you've got baby boomers that are active longer, right? So they're no longer they're empty nesters, but they still want to have their backyard and their barbecue. That's what we feel is kind of the built to rent trend, and I think we're still in the very early innings. Now, that's not to say we still love multifamily. We're still going to be owning multifamily. It's still a rental, but I think that if you're a younger family in its formation years, you can buy your business on a phone. You can buy crypto. You could do whatever that you want within your tech, but you love to live in a new home where you drive, you turn on your air conditioning if you're in Arizona on the way home, and you walk in. So those are the things that I think are changing a lot in the space that we're at. So we're constantly, what is the real estate tech that people care about? Do they want their dog yoga? They want their walking trails. They want their backyards, open spaces where we cut the grass. Those are the kinds of things that I think are changing really the economics of real estate in general. And real estate is such a large part of our economy, right? It is 35% of the GDP. So it's not just a small piece. It's a huge, huge piece of our economic stability going forward.
The tenant profile certainly has made a shift, I think, definitely in the States. And I think we're just on the forefront of seeing that in Canada. Canada, you'd be lucky to find Class A real estate from when you compare it to Class A, specifically talking about a multifamily in Canada. Most of our large multifamily, you guys would consider it as like Class D or Class C. And so, south of the border, when you start talking to people about that, it's a whole new world when you look at the style of tenant that a really good asset can attract. And you are looking for that. You are getting those people who are of the upper class from the income standpoint, and that they're actually going to look after it and have a pride of ownership. And they're going to truly call it a home. They're not just going to be, a tenant who's, here today, gone tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that, is changes the way that maybe investors look at it as well, because it's a whole different market now for when you're looking at your consumer.
Yeah, I think, for us, we build anywhere from affordable homes to some of the higher end, as you described, people that could buy if they wanted to, but they choose to rent for all the reasons that I stated before, the tech, et cetera. But we're kind of in this scenario now where we haven't built for the last 15 years in the States, and we've got mortgages that are $1,000 to $1,500 more than renting new stuff, right? That actually doesn't have that stigma that I referred to. So that's kind of all of those pieces. The fact that, for investors, that I really try to impress upon them is that we're building these communities that are people's homes, and you can kind of think of it, if you want, as subtraction, because we're pouring into these communities, and we're, donating dollars, etc. But it really, if you think about it, it is a multiplication problem. That's the point that we really want to hit on.
Yeah, the subtraction versus multiplication. I think that's a really interesting point that needs to just be flushed out, just a little bit to close off, because
sure.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll have a conversation with an investor, and we'll say something to the effect of, we're investing in this community, and we're going to do the playground, and we're going to do some community events, and this is what we really want to do for this community that we're building, this 200 units. And I'll get a response, well, that's great, do that with your money, and to a certain degree we have to. But if you're trying to think of it from just the property level, these are residents that call this their home. These are residents that stay longer because there are community events. There are people that they want to see every day. And if you think of it in that way, that it's not somebody living above you and below you, that you want to just kind of stay there for as little amount of time as you can until you can get to your next place, then it does become a multiplication problem. How can you invest in that community so that you've got the residents that you want that stay longer and tell people and are obviously blessed for being there?
The easiest conversation to have with that investor probably would be, when you did your last corporate retreat, did you do it in the basement of your office building, or did you go to the golf house and maybe go for a round of golf and then do a session, and then maybe go out for dinner and then do a session? And then did you have a keynote speaker that was kind of expensive but you knew would get people's headspace into the right spot? And did you create a culture that people wanted to share and people wanted to support each other? Did you have a vision of where that business would go? Well, all of those same principles apply to not just employees, but also to tenants. And so if we can invest into our tenants like we invest into our employees, we're going to have the same great outcomes.
That's so awesome. And it circles back to what you talk about all the time, which is this complacency idea, right? Is like, how can we bring the fun into succeeding, right? So that we don't have to consider it this slog. There's so many different things that this world gives us and the Lord above gives us that are blessings while we're doing not only good for the communities, but with people that are doing good and that are good at it.
And as an investor, I think you would feel that, number one, you're going to get a better return. So mathematically, follow the path to the math, and that'll set you free. And I think you'll see that return is going to come in a lot stronger. But you're also going to feel like you are creating communities. And I think the investor that's not only just looking for a high degree of return, but the investor who's looking to ethically invest is going to be that person who's going to say that sounds like an amazing opportunity.
No doubt.
Andy, man, it's been an absolute pleasure having a chat with you. I know we normally keep these to a minute and 30 minutes. We're at an hour here.
Oh no!
And
I told you I can't. You get me started, Steve. It's your fault, not mine.
Man, I'm going to put the blame all on you just because it's easier, and because it's my show. I can do that. So
the power that you've got. I know.
The power. Guys, Legacy Acquisitions, Andy McMullen. You got to go check him out at legacyacquisitions.com. What a person who's been very thoughtful on the show. Not just somebody who's looking to say, how many doors do I have and, what's my cap rate, but really, how do I create a community of people who work together, all from Philippines and North America, work together to really create these vibrant spaces for people to really call home and then produce a return for their investors as a icing on the top. So the cherry on the top of the icing. So Andy, it's been an absolute pleasure having a chat with you, my friend.
Always great talking with you, Steve. Thanks so much, man.
And guys, this is the money. This is the mindset. This is the mentoring podcast. We'll see you on the next one.